The first thing I noticed on my first day wasn't the glass walls or the silent efficiency of the office, it was the way the doors closed behind me with a final, airtight thud that seemed louder than it should have been, as if the building itself had decided I was now inside and there would be no turning back, and I remember standing there with my welcome folder clutched a little too tightly, heart beating faster than logic demanded, telling myself this was just nerves, just the adrenaline of being the new employee in a company everyone said changed lives if it didn't break you first. And then she stepped closer, not suddenly, not dramatically, but with a confidence that suggested she had already rehearsed this moment long before I ever walked in, her heels making no sound on the polished floor, her presence felt before it was fully seen, and when I finally looked up, really looked, I realized the air between us had shifted, grown heavier, charged, her smile slow and deliberate, not the polite corporate curve I'd practiced in the mirror that morning but something sharper, knowing, personal, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, warm, almost amused as she said, "I've been waiting," and in that instant every rehearsed response vanished from my mind because nothing about this felt like orientation, nothing about the way she held my gaze suggested coincidence. And my brain scrambled to reframe the moment into something normal, maybe she meant waiting for the paperwork, maybe. 4. The new hire, but my instincts, honed by years of reading rooms and people, whispered that this was about me, specifically me, and as she gestured for us to walk, her hand briefly brushing my arm in a way too intentional to be accidental, I became acutely aware of how little I actually knew about the place I'd just committed my future to, because as we moved deeper into the building, past offices that seemed too quiet, too observant, I felt like the story of my life had just shifted genres. Without asking my permission, and she talked as if we'd already had conversations I couldn't remember, referencing strengths I hadn't listed, decisions I hadn't yet made, and when I finally found the courage to ask how she knew so much about me, she glanced back with that same smile and said, "We don't hire resumes here, we hire trajectories," and something about that word lodged itself in my chest, because it implied momentum, inevitability, a direction already chosen, and by the time we reached the elevator, the same one whose doors had closed so decisively earlier, I realized the building hadn't felt like an opportunity when I arrived, it felt like a test, and now it felt like a threshold, and as the elevator began to descend instead of rise, despite my department being several floors above ground, I wondered for the first time whether getting this job had been luck or design, because she stood beside me, close enough that I could smell her perfume, subtle but unmistakable. And she leaned in just enough to say quietly, "Before we go any further, you should know something," and the pause that followed stretched longer than comfort allowed, longer than professionalism permitted, until my entire focus narrowed to the next words, the ones that would define whether I was stepping into a career or into something far more dangerous, far more personal, and just as the elevator slowed, lights dimming slightly, she finished, "Nothing that happens here is accidental," and in that moment, I understood why people either left this company within a year or never left at all, because some doors don't just close behind you, they lock, and as the elevator doors began to open again, revealing a corridor I hadn't seen on any map, I realized my first day wasn't about learning the job, it was about discovering why I had been chosen, and whether I was ready to become the person they already believed I was. And if you're watching this story unfold and you feel that tightening in your chest, that curiosity pulling you forward, then you already understand why journeys like this change people forever, so don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what comes next isn't just a continuation, it's the moment everything escalates, secrets surface, and the real reason she said, "I've been waiting," is finally revealed. The corridor beyond the elevator felt different from the rest of the building. Not darker exactly but quieter in a way that made every step sound like a decision, and as we walked side by side, I noticed how the walls were lined not with motivational posters or company slogans but with framed moments, photographs of people shaking hands, standing on stages, signing documents that clearly mattered, and yet none of the faces were labeled, as if the company believed legacy spoke louder than names, and she watched me take it all in with an expression that suggested this reaction was expected, calculated even, and when we finally stopped in front of a door without a number, without a title, she didn't open it right away, instead turning to face me fully for the first time, studying me with an intensity that stripped away the illusion of casual conversation, and she said, "Most people think their lives change because of luck or timing," pausing just long enough to let the idea settle before continuing, "but the truth is, someone always notices them first." And something about the way she said notices made my throat dry, because it implied observation long before introduction, and when the door finally opened, I expected a boardroom or a private office, but instead it was a space that felt almost intimate, warm lighting, a single table, 2 chairs, and a wall of glass overlooking the city far below, and as the door closed behind us once again with that same final sound, I realized the repetition wasn't accidental either, it was reinforcement. A reminder that every step forward removed an exit behind me, and she gestured for me to sit but remained standing herself, pacing slowly as she spoke, explaining that this company didn't just hire people to fill roles, it positioned them, shaped them, tested their limits until they either fractured or evolved, and then she stopped in front of me, leaned slightly against the table, and said the words that made everything snap into focus, "You were flagged 3 years ago," and when I asked how, she smiled again, softer this time, almost proud, and listed moments from my life no recruiter should know, choices I made under pressure, sacrifices I never talked about, a night I walked away from something easier because it didn't feel right, and with every sentence, the idea that I had simply applied for a job disintegrated, replaced by the unsettling truth that this interview had begun long before I ever sent a resume, and then she finally sat across from me, close enough that the glass wall reflected us as if we were already part of the same frame, and she said, "I've been waiting because today is when you find out who you actually work for," and with that she slid a thin folder across the table, not a contract but a profile, mine, annotated, analyzed, mapped like a future already in motion, and I understood then that this wasn't about power over me, it was about alignment, about whether I would resist becoming something larger than I had planned, and as the city lights flickered on outside, mirroring the spark of realization inside me, I made the only decision that made sense, not because I was fearless but because fear no longer felt like a reason to stop, and when I looked up at her and nodded, she didn't celebrate, didn't congratulate me, she simply stood, opened the door, and said, "Good. Now the real work begins," and as I stepped forward, crossing the line between who I was and who I was about to become, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: some stories aren't meant to be watched halfway, some journeys demand commitment, and if you've made it this far, if this story pulled you in and refused to let go, then subscribe to the channel right now, because this wasn't just the end of a chapter. It was the beginning of a much bigger game, and what happens next will change everything. The moment I crossed that doorway, the atmosphere shifted again, not with drama but with precision, like stepping onto a moving platform that had already calculated my weight, my balance, my direction, and the hallway beyond felt alive in a restrained way, screens lighting up as we passed, doors unlocking without her touching them, as if the building itself had acknowledged a new variable had been added to the equation. And she walked a half step ahead of me now, no longer guiding, but leading, speaking less, letting the silence do its work, until we entered a larger space where a handful of people stood around a curved table, all of them stopping mid-conversation the instant they saw me, their eyes assessing, not curious but confirmatory, like they were checking something off a list they'd already memorized, and she finally said my name out loud for the first time, which sent a strange jolt through me because it sounded different here, heavier, more permanent, and she announced that I had accepted, not been hired but accepted, and no one applauded, no one smiled, they simply nodded, which somehow felt more serious than any celebration could have, and that's when I realized this wasn't a workplace introduction. It was an initiation, and one of them slid another folder toward me, thicker than the last, filled with scenarios instead of data, problems without answers, moral crossroads disguised as business decisions, and as I flipped through them, I recognized patterns from my past choices again, only now they were magnified, scaled up, consequences multiplied, and she explained that the company operated in the space between what was legal and what was possible, between what people asked for and what they truly needed, and every employee here was selected because they had proven, at some point in their lives, that they could carry weight without needing recognition, that they could make hard calls alone and still sleep at night, and then she looked directly at me and said, "Your first test isn't about success, it's about restraint," before assigning me a task that sounded deceptively simple, almost mundane, yet everyone else in the room went still, and I felt it then, that subtle pressure in my chest. The awareness that this task had broken someone before me. And as I left the room alone, no escort this time, I understood why she had said she'd been waiting, because this wasn't about whether I was capable, it was about whether I was predictable, and predictability was the one thing this place could not afford, and as I stood by the glass wall again, city stretching endlessly below, I realized I was no longer reacting to the company. I was becoming part of its decision-making body, and that realization scared me more than any rejection ever could. Because power doesn't announce itself when it arrives, it just waits to see how you use it, and if this chapter has you leaning forward, wondering what that first test is and whether I pass or fail, then you already know you don't want to miss what comes next, so subscribe to the channel now, because chapter 4 is where the test begins, the stakes turn personal, and the cost of saying yes finally becomes clear. The task didn't arrive with instructions or urgency, just a time and a name, which somehow made it heavier, and as I sat alone in a small, glass-walled room reviewing the file that had been quietly delivered to my tablet, I realized the company's real genius wasn't secrecy, it was precision, because the name on the screen belonged to someone from my past, someone I hadn't spoken to in years but whose influence still echoed in the choices I made without realizing it. And suddenly the scenarios in the earlier folder made sense, they weren't hypotheticals, they were rehearsals. And as the details unfolded, financial vulnerabilities, a pending decision, a moment of weakness approaching like a slow-moving storm, I understood the test wasn't about what I could do, it was about what I would refuse to do, because the power being placed in my hands came with options that were effective, efficient, and ethically corrosive, and when she entered the room again without knocking, standing beside me rather than across from me this time, she didn't look at the screen, she looked at my face. Reading reactions rather than data, and she said quietly, "This is where most people reveal themselves," explaining that influence, real influence, is never about force but about timing, leverage, and silence, and then she asked the question that changed the weight of the room entirely. "If no one would ever know, what would you choose?" And for the first time since I walked into the building, I didn't answer immediately, because I felt the truth rising uncomfortably fast, that the easiest path would solve the problem cleanly but permanently alter who I was becoming, and as the city outside darkened fully into night, lights blinking like distant signals, I realized this company wasn't testing my loyalty to them, it was testing my loyalty to myself, to the version of me they had noticed years ago, the one who had walked away when no one was watching, and when I finally spoke, choosing restraint over result, uncertainty over control, she didn't smile, didn't approve or disapprove, she simply nodded once, as if logging the outcome internally, and said, "Good. That means you're still dangerous," before leaving me alone again with the knowledge that I had passed something invisible but irreversible, and as I sat there, understanding that every future decision would now carry more weight because someone was paying attention, I accepted the quiet truth that this job wasn't about climbing, it was about holding the line when no one else could, and if you're still here, if this story has pulled you this deep into the shadows with me, then don't disappear. Now, subscribe to the channel, because the next chapter reveals what happens when restraint has consequences, when someone challenges that choice, and when waiting finally turns into action.